a civilian national security force.
So what do you do with a hot mess of this magnitude? Well, like any fire, you cool it off by dispersing it, spreading it out. So like hot ashes from a fire, Mao cast his Red Guards across the Chinese countryside like a farmer sowing seeds. It was his down to the countryside movement. Red Guards were to board trains and buses and go down to the countryside. Peasants there would take them in and teach them to farm and the wisdom of the peasant life. And so, an entire generation of China's bright and educated youth left the cities en masse. And when they arrived, they were issued new hukou, household registrations. And Chinese were not allowed to move from one place to another in China without government permission. You stayed where your hukou was registered. After a while learning what they could from the peasants, the vast majority found that they would never receive permission to return to their homes and universities. They married, had children, and stayed there for the remainder of their lives. Mao and Jiang Qing had no more use for them, so just threw them away. China's lost generation. While in college in the 1980s, I had befriended a Chinese woman who was one of the lucky few who managed to get back to her hometown, Shanghai. After the universities opened, she sat for exams and did quite well. She eventually ended up going to university in the United States, where I met her. And for that, she was truly one in a million. So I asked her what she learned from the peasants during her 4 years in the countryside. She told me that when you spread pig dung with your bare hands, it's very difficult to get out from under your fingernails. So what of the American generation that academia, info-entertainment, and progressive government miseducated and used for their political purposes? Used by the corrupt old cynical self-appointed elites who were only looking to enhance their own power when rewarming socialism, to escape the limitations of our Constitution and to seize control of everything from healthcare to energy for themselves. What of the generation now saddled with massive college debt studying useless experimental so-called sciences such as gender studies? Meanwhile, the supposed elites who used them got even richer. Will this generation ever manage to clean from under their fingernails the dung they were conned into flinging this past decade? One thing is for sure, like China's lost generation, they'll never get the lost years back. It was the Welsh family curse, a half-century haunting by the demons of anger and hate. These demons preyed on Adam Welsh, his wife, and son David. Tormented souls languishing in a demonic death grip, all seemed lost for the Welsh family. David receives his grim inheritance through a brutal beating at the hands of his father at age 10, leaving him homeless. He picked up the family mantle of anger and hate, carrying it to new heights, spending his years blindly retaliating against the world that had wronged him. The Last, the Lost, and the Least is a powerful saga of one family's triumph over anger and hate that had nearly destroyed them all. Victory came in the form of forgiveness, redemption, and even a presidential pardon, all coming to fruition through the guiding grace of love. An inspiring novella based on a true story of recovery, The Last, the Lost, and the Least, is available at Amazon and wherever books are sold. All good things and bad things come to an end, and in 1976 the reign of terror of the great helmsman, the paramount leader of the Chinese Communist Party and revolution, died. The Western media, who even then were enamored with socialism, in spite of its consistent and dramatic failures and untold human suffering, described Mao in terms of being an inspiration for his nation. Academics, too, sang Mao's praises. A University of Michigan professor likened him to George Washington. The example of the modern-day media's tepid response, if any, to Chavez bringing socialist economic destruction and suffering to the people of Venezuela would lead one to conclude that today's media and academia would ignore and excuse the immense suffering of the Chinese people had it happened today, all in defense of socialism. But the Chinese people were not out of the woods yet. Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, certainly felt entitled to step into the void. She considered herself once and forever baptized in the waters of the Communist Revolution and therefore immune to criticism. She maneuvered behind the scenes with 3 others to form the notorious Gang of Four, her collaborators and co-conspirators with the excesses of the Cultural Revolution. Together, they attempted to pull the strings of China's deep state and use the same old dirty tricks to perpetuate their power after Mao's death, not unlike some familiar American politicians with the U.S. federal government's deep state after the 2016 election. But their time had passed. Decades of lies, a long list of failures, and elaborate and ludicrous deceptions simply destroyed any credibility that they had enjoyed while in the shadow of the great helmsman. The de facto remnants of Mao's deep state, they had barely a month after Mao's death before they were arrested. Deng Xiaoping, who had spent part of the intervening years under house arrest, deftly managed to navigate China's deep state apparatus that was heavily vested in decades of Mao faction rule. Triumphant, he rose to power officially in 1978. But the Chinese people pined for justice for all the suffering and destruction that Mao and his wife had caused the nation. The Gang of Four were put on trial in 1980 for their crimes against the Chinese people, convicted and incarcerated for the remainder of their lives. In the spotlight of the docket of an auditorium-sized courtroom, Jiang Qing lashed out at her accusers with fiery monologues. But she simply looked like a pathetic caricature from a bygone era. The thousands in attendance could be heard laughing at her every word, giggling nervously, partly in response to dousing the terror they had once felt from the unmitigated power that this despot had so brutally wielded, and partly with satisfaction for her so public humiliation. It was as if she would have shouted with indignance, "What difference does it now make?"
战争的时候，唯一留在前方追随毛泽东主席的，只有我一个女同志。你们躲到哪儿去了？
これは後世にとって一世一代の名演技でした。しかし裁判では何の役にも立たず死刑判決を
She's sentenced to death, commuted to life imprisonment, and eventually commits suicide in her cell.
最後は独房で自殺しています。
No capitalist by any means, Deng Xiaoping spent the following decade gradually dismantling the hardline communist deep state in favor of a more pragmatic socialism with Chinese characteristics variety. He'd finally get his shot at bringing his black cat, white cat pragmatism to bear on the colossal problems that China faced at the time. The legacy of China's nightmare with absolute socialism was 3 decades of injustice, death, and destruction. China's hardline communist deep state would not go quietly into that good night, though it would go peacefully. But it would take more than a decade for Deng Xiaoping to bring about general acceptance of market reforms alone. In some cases, old guard communists could be persuaded with financial inducements, say grants of real estate. Others would play more hard to get, but eventually come along. And some would never betray the absolute socialism revolution they dedicated their entire lives to and simply needed to die off before full-scale reforms could be implemented. Deng Xiaoping, who passed away in 1997 at age 92, simply outlasted them all. Effective implementation of market reforms, on the other hand, would take much longer. One of the first things Deng did was to open China's door to the outside world. It had been virtually closed for 30 years after all, and this was the 20th century. No country could successfully go it alone. He encouraged foreign investment into China to help develop the Chinese economy, and encouraged Chinese students to go abroad to help develop the Chinese people. But no doubt, when China opened its doors in 1978, its economy was a 12-cylinder engine that was sputtering along on 2 cylinders at best. Deng famously announced to the Chinese people of the transformation that lay ahead, "We must cross the river by feeling the stones with our feet." One good friend, one of the lucky few former Red Guards who managed to return to the city in university studies, remarked about the first time he saw a demand and supply curve. "I almost cried," he said. "This is right," I said to myself. He realized that he was finally seeing the truth after a lifetime of lies. Everything else I'd learned up to then was BS, he said. The reality is that, quietly, earlier during the 1970s, after the Cultural Revolution had simmered down, small-scale market-oriented practices began to spring up in rural areas. Essentially, people began to return to traditional practices. So when Deng Xiaoping introduced market reforms, as he was famous for doing, he was essentially codifying those practices as acceptable, and going much further by encouraging market reforms on a larger scale. In 1984, he created a special economic zone in Shenzhen, China, across the border from Hong Kong. It became his show-me experiment with market economics. Within the Shenzhen border, market practices were allowed that were strictly forbidden in other parts of China. Foreign investment poured in, and it wasn't long before rice fields turned into a shiny new city with factories, high-rise buildings, and traffic jams. Deng famously went to Shenzhen in 1992, and with construction cranes turning in the background, he publicly reiterated his earlier declaration. "Shenzhen has proven the correctness of our policy." And there were no objections. Over the coming years, the Shenzhen model was allowed to progressively metastasize across the nation, creating a burgeoning private and semi-private economy that rapidly grew, progressively supplanting large parts of China's state-owned economy. This transformation from absolute socialism occurred over a period that conveniently breaks into, yes, another 3 decades: the experimental phase of the 1980s, the critical mass phase of the 1990s, and the breakaway phase that started in the 2000s. Over that period, China's economic engine began to run ever more smoothly, adding a cylinder here and there over these 3 decades before running on all cylinders by the 2000s. And this is the era that I cover in my business book, Chocolate Fortunes.